If you want to stay here, you'd better learn your place, the note said, taped to one of my suitcases as it sat on the sidewalk in front of my own house. I stood there for a long moment, my car engine still running behind me, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the driveway I had walked 1,000 times before. For a second, I thought I might be at the wrong house. It looked the same, the pale blue siding Daniel had repainted 5 summers ago, the oak tree out front, its branches stretching wider than I remembered. Even the porch light was on, just like it always was when someone was expecting me home. But no one was expecting me, not anymore. My suitcases, 2 large ones, and the smaller carry-on I had taken for my trip, were lined up neatly along the curb, as if someone had taken the time to arrange them just so. Not thrown, not scattered. That would have felt emotional. This felt deliberate, controlled. I stepped out of the car slowly, closing the door with a quiet click that seemed too small for what I was looking at. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass, and somewhere down the street a lawnmower hummed, steady and indifferent, life continuing as if nothing had changed. I walked toward the bags, my shoes pressing against the concrete, each step heavier than the last. The note fluttered slightly in the breeze, the tape barely holding it in place. I reached out and peeled it off, careful not to tear it, as if preserving it somehow mattered. The handwriting was unmistakably Ashley's, clean, precise, almost elegant. If you want to stay here, you'll follow our rules. Otherwise, don't bother coming back. No greeting, no explanation, just terms. I read it twice, then a third time, not because I didn't understand it, but because some part of me still expected the words to rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. I glanced up at the house. The curtains in the living room were drawn, but a thin line of warm light slipped through the edges. Someone was inside. I knew they were. For a moment, I considered walking up to the front door, knocking the way I always had, waiting for Daniel to open it with that familiar half-smile. But something held me back. Maybe it was the note in my hand. Maybe it was the quiet certainty settling in my chest that if I knocked, no one would come. Or worse, they would, and everything would be said out loud, leaving no room for doubt. I set the note down on top of the suitcase and looked at my reflection in the darkened window of the car. At 68, I had learned to recognize certain moments for what they were. Not accidents, not misunderstandings, turning points. I had only been gone for 5 days, a short trip to visit an old friend up in Oregon, something Ashley herself had suggested, insisting I needed a break, that I should enjoy a little time away. I remembered how she smiled when she said it, how Daniel had nodded along, distracted, already looking at his phone. At the time, it had felt like concern. Now, standing on the sidewalk with my life packed into 2 suitcases, it felt like something else entirely. I crouched down and unzipped the smaller bag. Everything inside was folded, but not the way I had packed it. My sweaters were stacked tighter, my toiletries rearranged. Someone had gone through my things, not in anger, not in a rush, but carefully, as if they had every right. I zipped it back up and stood, brushing my hands together slowly. The house behind me remained silent. No footsteps, no door opening, just that steady glow of light behind closed curtains. I picked up the note again, smoothing it flat between my fingers, and for the first time I felt something shift. Not sharp, not loud, but cold and clear. They thought this was the end of something. A boundary drawn, a message delivered. But as I stood there, holding that piece of paper, I realized something else. They had made their move while I was away, quietly, confidently, certain I would come back confused, maybe even apologetic. They were wrong. I didn't knock on the door. I didn't call out. I simply stood there a moment longer, looking at the place I had once called home, and let the silence answer everything for me. I did not pick up the suitcases right away. Instead, I stood there on the sidewalk, holding that note, listening to the quiet hum of a neighborhood that had not changed, even though something in my life clearly had. A car passed by slowly, the driver glancing in my direction for a second longer than usual before continuing down the street. I wondered what it looked like from the outside, an older woman standing next to 2 packed suitcases in front of a house that still had its lights on. It must have looked temporary, like I was waiting for a ride, like I had somewhere else to go. I let that thought sit for a moment. Somewhere else to go. The words felt distant, almost unfamiliar, as if they belonged to someone else's story. I turned toward the house again and took a few steps closer, stopping just short of the walkway. From here, I could see the faint outline of movement behind the curtains, a shadow passing by, then disappearing. Someone was inside. They knew I was here, that much was clear, but the door remained closed. I did not raise my hand to knock, not because I was afraid of what they might say, but because I realized something simpler, something colder. The decision had already been made. Not in a moment of anger, not during an argument. This had been planned, quietly, carefully, while I was away packing a small bag for what I thought was a short, harmless trip. I could still remember the morning I left. Ashley had stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, her arms crossed loosely as she watched me pour my coffee. She had smiled, soft and easy, telling me I deserved a break, that she had been doing too much around the house. Daniel had kissed my cheek on his way out, distracted, already halfway out the door before I could finish asking him if he would be home for dinner that week. Nothing about that morning had felt unusual. That was what made it so precise. They had waited until I was gone. I let out a slow breath and finally bent down to lift one of the suitcases. It felt heavier than it should have, or maybe I was just more aware of the weight now. The handle was cool in my hand, steady, solid, unlike everything else about this moment. I carried it back to the car and placed it carefully in the trunk, then returned for the second one. The rhythm of the movement grounded me. Lift, walk, set down, repeat. By the time I reached for the smaller bag, I noticed something else. The front door had not opened once, not even a crack. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just silence. I paused, my hand resting on the handle of the last suitcase, and looked up at the house one more time. This place had been mine long before Ashley ever stepped inside it, before Daniel had grown tall enough to reach the top shelf in the kitchen, before the paint had faded, before the tree out front had grown wide enough to cast shade over the driveway. Every corner of that house held something I had built, something I had protected, something I had believed would always remain part of me. And yet here I was, standing outside it like a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. I picked up the last suitcase and carried it to the car, closing the trunk with a quiet, deliberate push. For a moment, I stood there with my hand resting against the metal, feeling the faint warmth left by the sun. Then I walked around to the driver's seat and got in, closing the door gently behind me. The interior of the car felt smaller than before, or maybe just quieter. I placed the note on the passenger seat, smoothing it out again, reading those same words without reacting this time. No anger, no confusion, just clarity. They had drawn a line. What they did not understand was that I had seen lines like this before. Not written on paper, but in actions, in choices, in the small ways people reveal exactly who they are when they believe no one is paying attention. I started the engine and let it idle for a few seconds, my eyes still on the house in front of me. Then, without looking back again, I shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the porch light on behind me, glowing softly for someone else.
The road ahead of me stretched out in a long, quiet line, the kind that usually felt familiar, but now seemed strangely distant, as if I were driving through a place I no longer belonged to. I did not turn on the radio. I did not reach for my phone. I just drove, both hands steady on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the fading sunlight ahead. It took me a few minutes to realize I had not decided where I was going. That thought might have unsettled me once, but now it simply settled into place, like everything else that had been shifting since I stepped out of the car in front of the house. I passed the grocery store where I used to shop every Sunday morning, the same one where Daniel would complain about the long lines when he was younger, tapping his foot impatiently beside me while I compared prices. A little farther down, I drove by the park where he learned how to ride a bicycle, wobbling down the path with his arms stretched out for balance, while I walked just behind him, ready to catch him if he fell. I remembered how he had looked back at me that day, smiling, proud of himself, certain I would always be there. I kept driving. The memories came quietly, not all at once, but in pieces, like photographs laid out on a table. Small moments, ordinary ones, the kind you do not realize are important until they are the only things left that still feel real. I turned onto a side street without thinking, following the curve of the road as it led me away from the familiar center of town. The houses here were different, smaller, closer together, the kind of place people moved to when they were starting over, not when they thought they had already built a life. I slowed down at a stop sign and rested my hands more firmly on the steering wheel, noticing how calm they felt. Not steady in the way of someone pretending everything was fine, but steady in the way of someone who had stopped expecting things to be different. Ashley had always been careful with her words. That was something I had noticed early on, even before I understood what it meant. She never said anything directly unkind. She did not need to. It was in the way she asked questions, the way she framed suggestions, the way she turned decisions into something that sounded reasonable, even generous. I could hear her voice now, clear as if she were sitting beside me in the car. Maybe it is time to think about something smaller, something easier to manage. You deserve less stress. At the time, I had nodded, thinking she was concerned, thinking she saw me as part of the family. I understood now that she had been measuring something else entirely: space, control, ownership. I stopped at a red light and glanced at the note still lying on the passenger seat. The words did not feel sharp anymore. They felt final. If you want to stay here, you will follow our rules. Otherwise, do not bother coming back. There was something almost polite about it, as if they believed they had offered me a choice.
I let out a quiet breath and looked up as the light turned green. They had made their decision while I was away. They had packed my things, moved them outside, and closed the door behind them. Not in anger, not in haste, but with certainty. That was what stayed with me the most, the certainty. I drove another mile before pulling into a small parking lot beside a coffee shop I had never been to before. The sign flickered slightly above the door, and inside I could see a few people sitting at tables, their heads bent over cups and conversations that had nothing to do with me. I parked the car and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle again. For a moment, I sat there without moving, my hands resting loosely in my lap. Then I reached for the note one more time, folding it carefully along its original crease and placing it inside my purse. Not as a reminder of what had been done to me, but as a record of it, something clear, something undeniable. I opened the car door and stepped out, the evening air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of coffee and something sweet from inside the shop. As I closed the door behind me, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think about until that moment. I was not driving away from my life. I was driving into whatever came next. And for the first time since I saw my suitcases on that sidewalk, that thought did not feel like loss. It felt like space. I pushed the door open and stepped inside the coffee shop, the soft chime above the entrance marking my arrival in a way that felt almost too gentle for everything that had just happened. The warmth inside wrapped around me immediately, carrying the scent of roasted beans and baked pastries, something steady and ordinary that did not ask questions. I paused just long enough to take it in before moving toward the counter, my steps measured, my posture straight, as if nothing about me had changed in the past hour. The young woman behind the register smiled politely, asking what I would like, and for a moment I realized how strange it felt to be asked such a simple question when everything else in my life had just shifted. I ordered a small black coffee, the kind I had been drinking for decades, and paid in cash, placing the bills neatly on the counter. My hands did not shake. That was something I noticed, not with pride, but with quiet awareness. I took the cup and moved to a table near the window, setting it down carefully before sitting across from it, my purse resting beside me. Outside, the world continued in its usual rhythm. Cars passed. A couple walked by, talking softly. Someone laughed in the distance. None of it paused to acknowledge what had happened to me, and somehow that felt right. I wrapped my hands around the cup, feeling the heat seep into my fingers, grounding me in the present moment. It was then, sitting there in that unfamiliar place, that the past began to arrange itself more clearly, not in scattered memories this time, but in a sequence that made sense. Ashley had not appeared in my life all at once.
She had eased into it, polite and attentive in the beginning, always careful to say the right things. I remembered the first time she visited the house, how she complimented everything, the curtains, the furniture, even the way the kitchen was organized. She had stood exactly where I was sitting now, metaphorically speaking, observing, understanding, learning. At the time, I had thought she was trying to fit in. Now I understood she had been taking inventory. Daniel had changed slowly. That was the part I had resisted seeing, not because the signs were not there, but because they were so small, so easy to explain away. He started spending less time in the living room, more time upstairs with Ashley. Conversations became shorter, then fewer. Decisions that once included me were suddenly presented as already made. At first, I told myself that was natural. He had his own life now, his own family. That was how it was supposed to be. But there were moments, small and quiet, that did not fit that explanation, like the time I found the spare key missing from its usual place in the kitchen drawer, and when I asked about it, Ashley smiled and said it was safer if fewer copies were floating around. Or the afternoon Daniel mentioned, almost casually, that they had been looking at real estate listings, something about future planning, though they were already living in a house that had been ours long before it was ever theirs.
I lifted the coffee to my lips and took a slow sip, the bitterness settling in, familiar and steady. I did not rush the thought that followed. I let it form completely before I acknowledged it. This had not started with the note. It had not even started with my trip. It had started much earlier, in conversations I had dismissed, in decisions I had allowed, in moments where I chose peace over clarity. I set the cup back down and leaned slightly back in my chair, my gaze drifting to the window but not really focusing on anything outside. I could see it now, the way Ashley had shifted things piece by piece, never enough to cause a scene, never enough for Daniel to question her directly, always just enough to move me slightly further to the edge. And Daniel, my son, had not stopped her. That was the part that settled deepest, not because he was cruel, but because he had become comfortable with the changes, comfortable with my silence. I reached into my purse and touched the folded note, not pulling it out this time, just confirming it was there. It was not the beginning of the story. It was the result. A final step in something that had been unfolding for a long time, quietly, patiently, until it reached a point where they no longer felt the need to hide it. I sat there for a few more minutes, finishing my coffee at an unhurried pace, letting the realization settle fully into place. When I stood up, I did not feel displaced. I felt aware. And awareness, I had learned over the years, was far more useful than shock. I left the coffee shop without rushing, placing the empty cup in the trash near the door before stepping back outside into the evening air, which had cooled just enough to make me notice it against my skin. The parking lot was quieter now, only a few cars remaining, their headlights flickering on one by one as the daylight faded. I walked back to my car at a steady pace, not looking around for anything in particular, but aware of everything at once in a way I had not been earlier. When I opened the trunk, the sight of my suitcases no longer felt like a shock. They looked organized, contained, as if someone had packed up a chapter and placed it neatly on hold. I stood there for a moment, resting my hand lightly on one of the handles, and allowed myself to think about the years that had led to this point, not in fragments this time, but in a full, uninterrupted line. There had been a time when that house felt too large for just two people. After my husband passed, the quiet inside those walls had stretched in ways I had not been prepared for. I remembered how Daniel started visiting more often back then, bringing groceries, fixing things that did not need fixing, lingering just a little longer at the kitchen table. When he told me he and Ashley were thinking about moving in, it had felt like a gift, a way to fill the space with life again. I had said yes without hesitation, not because I needed help, but because I believed we were building something together. I closed the trunk gently and walked around to the driver's side, pausing before getting in. That decision, the one that had seemed so natural at the time, now stood out clearly, not as a mistake, but as a moment where everything began to shift. Ashley had been gracious in the beginning. She insisted on helping with meals, on reorganizing small things around the house to make it more efficient. I had let her, telling myself it was only fair, that she should feel comfortable in her own home. I realize now how easily that phrase had changed meaning without me noticing. It had started as my home, then it became our home, and somewhere along the way, without any clear conversation, it had turned into theirs. I sat down in the driver's seat but did not start the engine right away. Instead, I looked straight ahead, letting the quiet settle again.
There were specific moments that returned now with more clarity than before. The time Ashley suggested I move my things out of the master bedroom because the stairs were becoming a safety concern, even though I had never once had trouble climbing them. The day Daniel mentioned converting part of the house into a home office for Ashley, asking if I would mind shifting some of my storage to the garage. Each suggestion had sounded reasonable on its own, thoughtful even, but together they formed a pattern that I had not allowed myself to fully see. I placed my hands on the steering wheel and exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that understanding settle into something solid. This had never been about space. It had never been about convenience or safety or even family harmony. It had been about ownership, about control, about deciding who belonged and who did not. And somewhere along the way, I had been moved piece by piece from the center of that home to its edges, until there was nowhere left for me to stand, except outside. I reached into my purse again and took out the folded note, holding it between my fingers as I looked at it one more time. The words had not changed, but my understanding of them had. This was not an invitation to negotiate. It was not even a request. It was a declaration. I folded it back carefully and placed it inside my wallet this time, tucking it into a space where I kept important things, documents that mattered, records that could not be ignored. Then, finally, I started the engine. The car came to life with a soft vibration, steady and reliable. I adjusted my seat slightly, checked the mirrors out of habit, and rested my hands on the wheel. For the first time since I saw those suitcases on the sidewalk, I allowed myself to consider something beyond what had been taken from me. Not where I had come from, but what I still had. And as I sat there in the dimming light, I realized that while they had removed me from that house, they had not taken everything. Not even close. I pulled out of the parking lot slowly, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the dimming evening, and for the first time since everything unfolded, I knew exactly where I was going. It was not far, just across town, to a place I had not visited in months, not because I could not, but because I had not needed to. Now, it felt like the only place that made sense. The drive was quiet, the streets gradually thinning out as I moved away from the busier part of town. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting soft pools of light along the road, and I followed them without hesitation. There was something steady about the motion, something grounding in the simple act of moving forward with intention. After about 15 minutes, I turned into a familiar lot, smaller than the one I had just left, with only a handful of cars parked in front of a modest brick building. The sign above the entrance was understated, almost easy to miss if you were not looking for it. I parked near the side, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle around me again. Then I reached into my purse and took out a small set of keys, separate from the ones I used every day. I had not touched them in a long time, but they felt just as familiar in my hand as they always had. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing faintly against the pavement. The door opened with a soft click, and I stepped inside, greeted by a quiet, dimly lit hallway that smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. The air was still, undisturbed, as if nothing had changed here at all. I walked down the corridor, counting the doors without thinking, until I reached the one I knew was mine. I paused for just a second, then inserted the key and turned it. The lock gave way easily. Inside, the room was exactly as I had left it, a small office space, neatly arranged, with a desk against the far wall and a filing cabinet beside it. A place I had kept separate from the house, not out of secrecy, but out of habit. Organization had always been something I valued. I closed the door behind me and stepped further inside, setting my purse down on the desk. The lamp in the corner cast a warm, steady light, illuminating the space without harshness. Everything was in order, exactly where it should be. I moved to the filing cabinet and opened the top drawer, sliding it out smoothly. Rows of neatly labeled folders greeted me, each one representing a part of my life that had been carefully documented over the years. Bills, records, correspondence, and then, further back, the ones that mattered most. I reached for a specific folder, the label clear and familiar, and pulled it free. It was slightly thicker than the others, its contents organized with the same care I had given everything else. I carried it back to the desk and set it down, opening it slowly. The papers inside were crisp, untouched since the last time I reviewed them. I flipped through them methodically, not searching, but confirming. Names, dates, signatures, everything exactly as it had been arranged. My name, my ownership, my decisions. The house. All of it. I rested my hand lightly on the stack of documents and let out a slow, steady breath. This was what they had not considered, not because it was hidden, but because they had never asked. They had assumed, as people often do, that what they saw was all there was, that living in a place meant having control over it, that proximity meant ownership. I closed the folder gently and sat down in the chair behind the desk, the leather cool beneath me. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of the situation fully, not as something overwhelming, but as something clear. They had made their move, quiet, certain, final in their minds. And now, sitting here with everything laid out in front of me, I understood something just as clearly. The situation had changed, but not in the way they believed. I adjusted the folder so it sat squarely in front of me, my fingers resting lightly on its edge, and allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to settle on my face. Not out of satisfaction, not yet, but out of recognition. They thought they had removed me from the equation. They had not realized I was the one who had written it in the first place. I did not rush. That was the first decision I made as I sat there with the folder in front of me, my hands resting lightly on the documents that still carried my name in clear, undeniable print. There was no need for urgency. Everything that mattered had already been set in place long before that note ever touched my suitcase. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back into the filing cabinet, sliding the drawer shut with a quiet, controlled motion. The sound echoed softly in the small office, final in a way that felt appropriate. Then I returned to the desk and reached for my purse, pulling out my phone. The screen lit up immediately, the time displayed in the corner, along with a few missed notifications that I had not yet checked. I ignored them. Instead, I scrolled to a contact I had not called in some time, not because I did not trust him, but because I had not needed to, until now. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening as it rang once, then twice, before a familiar voice answered, steady and professional. I greeted him by name and spoke calmly, explaining only what was necessary, not the emotions, not the details that did not matter, just the facts. I had returned home. My belongings had been placed outside. I no longer had access to the property. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, not of confusion, but of understanding. He knew exactly what I was saying, even without me saying it directly. He asked a few questions, precise ones, the kind that cut straight to what mattered. I answered each one clearly, my voice even, my thoughts organized. There was no hesitation in me anymore, not after what I had just seen. When the call ended, I set the phone down on the desk and sat back in the chair, letting the quiet settle around me again. This time it felt different. Not empty, not uncertain. Structured, like a plan unfolding exactly as it should. I looked around the room, taking in the small details I had always overlooked. The framed certificate on the wall, the neatly stacked folders, the clock ticking softly above the door. Everything here had been preserved because I had chosen to preserve it. Not out of fear, not out of suspicion, but out of discipline. I had always believed in keeping things in order, even when there was no immediate reason to. Now I understood the value of that choice more clearly than ever. I stood up slowly and walked back to the filing cabinet, opening the drawer once more, not to search, but to confirm. The folder was still there, exactly where I had placed it. I did not need to open it again. I already knew what it contained. Instead, I closed the drawer and rested my hand briefly against the cool metal surface, allowing myself a single moment of stillness. They had believed that by removing me physically, they had removed me entirely, that the absence of my presence in that house meant the absence of my authority over it. It was a simple assumption, a common one, and it was exactly where they had made their mistake. I turned away from the cabinet and picked up my purse, slipping the phone back inside. Then I reached for the light switch and paused for just a second before turning it off, watching as the room dimmed into shadow, leaving only the faint glow from the hallway beyond. I stepped outside and locked the door behind me, the soft click of the lock settling into place with quiet certainty. As I walked back to my car, the night air felt cooler now, sharper, carrying with it a sense of clarity that had not been there before. I opened the driver's door and sat down, placing my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine right away. For a moment, I simply sat there, looking straight ahead into the darkened lot, aware of the stillness around me. Then, slowly, I allowed a single thought to settle fully into place, clear and unwavering. They had already shown me what they were willing to do. Now, it was my turn to decide what I would do next.
I started the engine, the low hum filling the quiet space around me, and this time I did not hesitate before pulling out of the lot. The road back felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. Every turn, every streetlight, every passing car seemed sharper, more defined, as if the world had shifted into focus in a way I had not noticed before. I drove with purpose, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind no longer circling around questions, but moving forward with decisions already made. When I turned onto my street, the familiar line of houses came into view, each one sitting quietly under the glow of porch lights and evening stillness. My house stood exactly where it always had, unchanged from the outside, its windows lit, its structure intact, as if nothing inside had been disrupted. I slowed the car but did not stop immediately, letting it roll past the driveway once before circling back. It was not hesitation, it was observation. When I finally pulled up to the curb, I parked a few feet away from where I had been earlier, the engine still running as I sat there, looking at the front door. The same door that had remained closed, the same door that had not opened when I stood there with my suitcases. I turned off the engine and stepped out, closing the door behind me with a quiet click. The air was cooler now, the night settling in fully, wrapping the neighborhood in a calm that felt almost deliberate. I walked toward the house slowly, not rushing, not pausing, simply moving forward with the same steady rhythm I had carried all evening. This time, I did not stop at the edge of the walkway. I continued all the way to the front door. The porch light cast a soft glow over the entry, illuminating the small details I had always known by heart. The slight chip in the paint near the handle, the faint creak in the top step. Nothing had changed, except what it meant. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting just inches from the door, not knocking, not reaching for the handle, just letting the moment settle. Then slowly, I reached into my purse and took out a different set of keys. Not the ones I used every day, not the ones they had likely assumed defined my access. These were older, heavier, the originals. I held one between my fingers and inserted it into the lock, turning it with a calm, deliberate motion. The mechanism responded instantly, the soft click of the lock disengaging sounding almost louder than it should have in the quiet night. I opened the door and stepped inside. The warmth of the house greeted me immediately, along with the familiar scent of the place I had lived in for years. Nothing inside looked out of place. The furniture remained where it always had. The lights were on. The space was occupied, but not altered. I closed the door behind me and set my purse down on the small table near the entrance, my movements controlled, unhurried. From somewhere deeper in the house, I could hear faint movement, the sound of voices lowering abruptly, as if someone had just realized something unexpected. I did not call out. I did not announce myself. Instead, I walked forward, each step measured, my presence no longer something to be questioned or denied. I moved through the living room, past the same furniture, the same photographs, the same details that had once told the story of my life, now carrying a different weight entirely. As I reached the center of the room, I stopped, not because I needed to, but because I understood something clearly in that moment. This was not about reclaiming space. It was about reminding them of something they had chosen to forget. I stood there quietly, listening as the house adjusted to my presence again, the silence shifting, the atmosphere changing in a way that could not be ignored. Then, without raising my voice, without altering my expression, I spoke, my tone calm, steady, and unmistakably certain. I am not here to argue. I am here because this is still my house.
I did not need to raise my voice. The words settled into the room with a quiet weight, and for a moment, no one responded. Then I heard footsteps, hesitant at first, then more certain as they approached. Ashley appeared at the edge of the hallway, her expression frozen somewhere between surprise and calculation, as if she were trying to decide which version of herself to present. Behind her, Daniel stood a few steps back, his shoulders slightly tense, his eyes moving between me and the door, as if searching for something that no longer existed. I did not move toward them. I did not need to. I simply stood where I was, my posture relaxed, my presence steady, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for them to understand that this was not a moment they could redirect. Ashley spoke first, her tone measured, controlled, as if nothing unusual had happened. She asked how I got inside, as if the answer were not already obvious. I looked at her, not unkindly, but without offering anything more than the truth. I used my key, the original one, the one that still works. She blinked, just once, and I could see it then, the first small crack in the certainty she had been holding on to. Daniel shifted his weight, his gaze finally meeting mine, and for a brief second I saw something there that had been missing for a long time. Not guilt, not yet, but awareness. I reached into my purse and took out the folded paper, placing it gently on the table beside me. I did not push it toward them. I did not need to. They both knew what it was. I found this on my suitcase, I said, my voice even, almost conversational. I read it. I understood it. I let the words hang there, not as an accusation, but as a statement. Ashley stepped forward slightly, her composure returning in small, practiced pieces. She began to explain, her words tearful, framed in the language she had always used. Boundaries. Space. What is best for everyone. I listened without interrupting, my expression unchanged, my attention steady. When she finished, the room fell quiet again. That was when I spoke. Not louder, not sharper, but clearer. You made a decision, I said, while I was away, without asking me, without telling me. I paused, not for effect, but because the next words required no emphasis. That part is not open for discussion. Daniel inhaled slowly, as if preparing to say something, but he stopped, the words never fully forming. I watched him for a moment, recognizing the hesitation, the distance that had grown over time, now standing between us in a way that could no longer be ignored. Then I reached into my purse once more and removed a thin folder, placing it on the table beside the note. This time I did slide it forward slightly, just enough for them to see the cover. My name was printed clearly across the top. Beneath it, the address of the house. Official, documented, unmistakable. I did not open it. I did not need to. Everything inside it had already been established long before tonight. This house, I said calmly, is not something you get to assign rules to. Not for me, not like this. Ashley's expression shifted again, more quickly this time, her confidence adjusting as she tried to understand what she had overlooked. Daniel looked down at the folder, then back at me, and I could see it now, the realization beginning to settle. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like something falling into place whether he wanted it to or not. I did not continue speaking. I did not explain further. There was nothing else to clarify. The truth did not require elaboration. It only required acknowledgement. I picked up the note from the table and folded it once more, placing it back into my purse with the same care as before. Then I looked at both of them, my gaze steady, my voice quiet but firm. You thought leaving my things outside would make this simple. It does not. I let that settle, then added without changing my tone, this is still my home, and I am not leaving it on your terms. I turned then, not to walk away, but to move further inside, toward the part of the house that had always been mine, my steps unhurried, my presence no longer something they could dismiss or redefine. Behind me, the silence followed, no longer empty, but filled with the weight of something they could not undo.